All right, here is the video that I've been requested to make by several people, an Arch Linux installation guide. Let's get started. First thing we'll need, of course, is our Arch Linux ISO, which you can download from archlinux.org/download. Like most Linux distros, they do offer a BitTorrent option for downloading it, which is what I recommend you use. Also, be sure to seed if you have bandwidth available. If you don't want to do that, though, there's plenty of mirrors that you can download from as well. You can pick your country to make sure that you get a fast download speed. Once we have our ISO, come on over to VirtualBox. And as always, the steps that I'm going to show you in VirtualBox are pretty much identical to the steps needed to deploy this to hardware. The only difference is you'll have to create a bootable USB with your distro of choice on it and boot from that instead of booting from a virtual CD drive. But once you're booted from USB, the steps I'm going to show you are going to be pretty much the same for deploying it to hardware or in a virtual machine. So in VirtualBox, I'm going to click New, and I'm going to call this Arch Linux, and it should have automatically chosen the correct type and the correct version, Arch Linux 64-bit. And then I'm going to crank up the memory to 4 gigs. Now, this isn't really necessary depending on what you're going to be doing in Arch. I mean, the base amount of RAM that Arch would need is only about 1 gig, and that's only if you're going to be using a desktop environment. Because Arch is a minimalist distro, so you could definitely get away with less memory than this. And create a virtual hard disk. I'm going to make it VDI, fixed size, so it's a little bit faster. And I'll crank that up to about 30 gigs. Again, you could get away with less than this depending on what you're doing. Like the minimum you'll want is probably around 20 gigs. And then create. Then we'll go into the settings and change a few other things. First, we're going to make our hard disk the first boot priority so that we can automatically boot into our system after we install it. I'm going to add a second processor just so the installation goes a little quicker. Crank up my video memory to 128 megs. Change the adapter type to VBox VGA. And last but not least, I'm going to add my ISO file so that we can actually boot to it and get started with the install. Is there anything I missed? Nope, everything looks good. So let's go ahead and start booting. And as always, my VM started on the other monitor, so I'll drag it on to this one. So this is the screen that you'll be greeted with when you first boot Arch Linux. The option you want to choose is Boot Arch Linux. And it's going to load everything up for us. And it's going to drop us into a root shell. Now, the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that our internet is working. So go ahead and ping a website to see if you get a response back. And of course, I know my internet is good because I'm on a virtual adapter. Now, if you're installing this to hardware, and this advice really goes for any Linux distribution that you want to install, when you want to have it on a PC or laptop, try to connect that computer over an Ethernet connection, because Ethernet tends to just work and it's a lot less of a hassle. Now, if you don't have physical access to your router or you bought a Zoomer laptop that doesn't have an RJ45 port, first of all, you fucked up by doing that, but the Arch devs, they have your back. You can use this command Wi-Fi menu, which won't work on my system because it's a VM that doesn't have Wi-Fi. But on a laptop, this will produce an N-curses menu for you to navigate and then connect to your Wi-Fi network. So if you need to install Arch on some crappy laptop, just pause the video, do that, and then resume once you ping successfully. Next, we want to sync our clock. So we can do that with time-date-ctl, set ntp true. And now we want to start with partitioning our drive. So if I lsblk, This will show you all the devices that are attached. If you're on hardware, you may have quite a few more disk and partition here. Depending on how many disks and partitions you've configured already, it's really important to make sure that we choose the right disk to partition though, because if you format the wrong one that has your Windows partition or another Linux partition or even just a data drive with no OS on it, then you're going to end up nuking all of your data. So pay close attention to the name column and the size column. You should try and figure out ahead of time what disk name you want to install to and what size it is, so you can double check all of that here. I already know that SDA is the disk that I want, so it should also be the same disk for you if you're following along in VirtualBox. So I'm going to cfdisk dev SDA. And the first thing we need to set is the label type. Now this confuses a lot of novice users, but I'll give you the most straightforward explanation I can. If you're installing Arch to a newer physical system, meaning not a virtualized environment like this, and the disk you're installing to is larger than 2 terabytes, then you'll want to use GPT. If you don't have both of those conditions in your computer, then you should use DOS. Really, if your hard disk is greater than 2 terabytes, that's the main reason to use GPT, because DOS will still work with UEFI if you have that type of BIOS. But as long as the disk is under 2 terabytes, if it's above that, then DOS isn't going to work. So I'm going to use DOS as my label. And once you've picked your label, you'll be in a menu that looks like this. Now we need to start partitioning these disks. And the first thing that I'm going to make is the boot partition. So for that, we only need 128 megs since I'm going to be using grub. If you're going to be using some other like more bloated bootloader, then you might need to give more to this, like 256 or 512. 512 should cut it for any bootloader. I don't know any that are so bloated that they need more than that. And we need to, of course, make this bootable, so you can press B to set the boot flag. And then this other one, I'm just going to give it the rest of the memory. Make it primary, and then we want to write these changes, and then we can quit out of cfdisk. And then the next thing we need to do is we need to format it as ext4. So we'll mkfs.ext4 the first partition, and then mkfs.ext4 dev sda2. Now, this is a little different than some other partitioning schemes that you may have seen in the past, because a lot of the time people will create a swap partition or they'll create a home partition. Every distro for the bare minimum only needs boot and root. Home partition, it's really useful if you're going to be running several different Linux distributions on the same disk, because then they can all just share a home partition. I'm obviously not going to be doing that, so I'm not going to make it. And then for swap it's a little bit of a controversy. In my opinion, you don't really need swap if you have a decent amount of RAM, because what swap basically does is it allows your computer to treat hard disk space as extra RAM if you run out. But I've got 16 gigs of DDR3 inside of my machine, and I never go over it. Even if I'm rendering a 4K video, I don't go over it. And honestly, if you are doing something like that and you find yourself running out of RAM, you would just be better off adding more. Like my machine could go up to 32 gigs if I really wanted to. And you know, swap speed is just so slow. Like even if you use an SSD as swap, it's going to be something like 20 times slower than your RAM speed. So I personally find it to be unnecessary, but if you're on a really old machine, then you may want to create a swap partition as well. The Arch wiki covers how to do that. So now that we've partitioned and formatted our boot and root, we need to go ahead and mount our root partition. The command to do that is mount dev sda2. And we want the mount point to be MNT. That's the traditional place to do it, but this could be any folder you want. I'm just going to follow tradition though, because there's no good reason not to. And then we need to create a directory on mount for boot, and then we want to mount dev sda1, which is our boot partition, to that boot folder. So now if I lsblk, you can see that I have SDA1 and SDA2. They have the size that I specified for them in CF disk, and they are mounted in the areas I specified. So if your LSBLK looks similar to mine, maybe you decided to do a home and a swap partition, but as long as that's all configured correctly, then you've already finished the most difficult part of an Arch install. So now we're going to use this command called pacstrap, which is what the Arch Linux elitists don't want you to know about, because this command basically installs Arch Linux for you. So the way that you would run this is pacstrap, then point it to the folder where you mounted everything, which is mnt. And then we want to add some options. We want to add base-devel, linux-firmware, and vim. Now, these options contain groups of packages that you'd want on pretty much any Linux system. Base contains, well, base tools, as its name implies. Base-devel contains a lot of development tools that you'll probably need, like sudo and grep, as well as some compilers that you'll need. Linux is your kernel, because you can't really use an OS without a kernel. And Linux firmware contains firmware for common hardware. And I just want to include Vim. You don't actually have to do the Vim one, but you guys know that I'm a Vim elitist, and there's some text editing that we're going to have to do later in this install, and I don't want to use some dirty bullshit like nano to do that. So pacstrap is still running. This may take a couple of minutes to run depending on your internet connection. I'm just going to pause the video to save a little bit of time and resume when it's done. Now that this command is done, there's a few more things we need to configure before we can boot into Arch. Let's start by making an FSTab file. Your FSTab file basically just contains all the drives that Linux might try to load whenever you're booting up. And it's really easy to generate this. We can just gen fstab mnt. And actually, let me use this as an opportunity to steer you away from a mistake that a lot of Linux users make. So when you generate fstab using the defaults like I just did, you can see the syntax that it uses, but this isn't a good practice because the UUID for your drives are commented out, and it's using the device ID of your drive to identify it. The reason that this is bad is because a drive's device ID can change. Say, for example, if I was installing this on a PC with multiple physical drives, and one drive would be called like SDA, another would be SDB, SDC, so on and so forth. But if the SDA drive were to die or become non-accessible for some reason, your SDB drive could take on the SDA device ID. So SDA, SDB, SDC, it's not a unique identifier, but this hex string for the UUID is, and it will never change. So to generate a proper FSTab config, we want to use a similar command, but with the U option for mount, and then we need to basically spit this out into our FSTab file. So we can do that with the double arrow, mnt, etc, FSTab, so that the command will be directed there. And if you want to just see what that file looks like, that's exactly what it'll look like. So you see how the dev SDA is commented out now, and it's using the UUID instead. So now it's time to arch-chroot into our Arch installation. So arch-chroot mnt bin bash. And you may have noticed that my command prompt here changed. Now, this is because we have changed root from our USB or virtual CD drive, since I'm in VirtualBox, into our actual Arch Linux installation. So if I were to pwd here, it tells us that we're in root. We're no longer in mnt. And if I ls, You should recognize some of these folders. It's all of the folders that you would typically have in a Linux root file system. And we also have access to pacman now, which is the package manager in Arch, pretty much the same thing as apt if you're coming from Ubuntu. So now we want to install some very basic tools like a network manager so that we can actually have internet, and grub so that when we boot the machine, we don't have to do so manually. So pacman s network manager and grub. So this is going to install both of those tools. And once that's done installing, we want systemd to start the network manager whenever we boot, because it's nice to have internet after booting. So we can do that with systemctl enable network and network manager. Make sure you spell it right and make sure you capitalize the first N and the first M. And then we have to configure grub so it actually knows what to boot. So grub-install dev SDA. Don't put SDA1 or SDB1 if you're installing to that drive. We aren't configuring a grub. We aren't configuring grub on that partition. We need to configure it on the entire drive. And then we want to generate our configuration files. So the command for that is grub-mkconfig boot grub.cfg. And take a look at the output of this command. So if it doesn't say found Linux image and found init.rd image, then you probably forgot to pacstrap your kernel. So go back and do that, because if you don't do it, you're not going to have a kernel to actually boot. Now go ahead and set a password for your root user, because it's a very bad idea to leave that unprotected. So just run the command password, passwd, and then type in the password you want to use, type the same thing again. Now we need to generate our locale. So vim into etc locale.gen. And this is just selecting the language that we want to use on our system. So search for what you want to use. The one I'll be using is United States English. So I'll search for ENUS and go down to where it's in the group of all the languages. So here they are right here. I'm going to uncomment the UTF and the ISO, then right quit that. And then we want to generate it. So we want to do locale gen. And you can see here it generated the two locales that I need to use. And then we want to also define our language in locale.conf. So vim into that. And the file doesn't exist, so you can't do tab autocomplete, just vim etc locale.conf. And then in here, we're going to type lang equals enus.utf8, or whichever language you decided to use. Right quit that. And then we want to set our host name. So this is going to be the name that shows up in your shell after your username. So right now you see that it's going to be arch-iso. It's still going to be arch-iso while we're in this chroot environment. So vim into etc hostname. And I'm just going to call mine archbox. You can call it arch or, whatever you want to use. All right, and then finally, we want to set our time zone. Now, you don't actually have to do this, but your clock is most likely going to display the wrong time if you don't. We already have all the time zones on our PC, so we just have to link the correct one to our local time file. So the command for that is ln-sf, and then the time zones are located in user, share, zone info. And if I tab here, here, you can see all the different regions. So you need to select whichever region corresponds to where you're at. I'm in America. And then you need to select the city that has your time zone. So you can see all the different cities here. I'm just going to use New York since I'm on the East Coast. And then we're going to connect that to etc local time. And now you're done. So let's exit out of this chroot environment with just the exit command. And now we want to unmount our root and boot with umount rmnt. So that's just going to unmount everything. And then we can reboot. As long as you set your disk to the first boot priority, which I think I did, and bam, this is our Arch Linux. So go ahead and boot from it. And then it's going to ask you to log in. The only login that we have right now is root. So I'm going to type root, type in the password that I made. And here we go. We are in Arch Linux. Go ahead and install neofetch. Very, very important. Run neofetch. Take a screenshot of it and share it with all the kids at school. Show them that you are now a cool kid Arch user. So from this point on, what you'll want to do is configure your system, set up a desktop environment, users, and all that good stuff. I'll show you guys in another video how to do that because this one's already gone a little bit long. But for now, be sure to like and share this video because every other Arch Linux tutorial out there is too long or incorrect.